Listen to me carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is not just a story, it is not just history, it is not just politics, it is the sound of destiny itself reshaping the planet. There comes a moment when one decision, one phone call, one act in the silence of the night has the weight of centuries behind it, and the force of the future ahead of it. There comes a moment when the fate of nations turns not in the daylight of parliaments and conferences, but in the unseen hours when the world is asleep and the leader is wide awake, carrying the burden of billions on his shoulders. That moment came with a late night call, and that call shook the foundations of the world order forever. Imagine it. The world outside was quiet, but inside the room the air was heavy, the silence was alive, the walls themselves seemed to lean in to hear what decision would be made. The phone was not just a device. It was a weapon, a torch, a symbol. To pick it up was to choose. To speak was to unleash. And in that midnight moment, a leader made a choice, and the world that we knew was gone forever. It was not an explosion, it was not an invasion, it was not an army marching. It was words, spoken with clarity, spoken with certainty, spoken with the iron weight of willpower. That call was a command that split history into before and after. You must understand something. Power does not always roar like thunder. Sometimes power whispers, and yet that whisper bends steel, it moves mountains, it rewrites destiny. That night was not about power as the world has known it, but power as the world would come to know it. The old order had been built for decades on intimidation, manipulation, dominance by a few, and submission by the many. The old order thought it was unbreakable. They thought they could write the rules forever, and the rest of the world would bow. But the late night call declared, no more, enough. The age of imbalance, the age of arrogance, the age of the few dictating to the many was over. The world had a new balance, a new center of gravity, a new force of destiny, and it began with one decisive moment. Let me tell you why this was not just another diplomatic gesture, not just another empty speech, not just another political headline. This was courage in action. This was leadership at its purest form. Because leadership is not about pleasing everyone. Leadership is not about waiting for consensus, waiting for permission, waiting for applause. Leadership is about seeing the truth when others are blind and having the strength to act when others are frozen. Leadership is about making the hard call when the stakes are higher than ever, when hesitation means collapse and action means transformation. That is what happened that night. One man, one phone, one decision, and suddenly the world was a different place. The call was not made with trembling hands or uncertain words. It was made with the iron voice of conviction. It was a challenge to the world. You can no longer ignore us. You can no longer dictate terms. You can no longer shape reality without us. We are not just a player. We are the player. We are not just part of history. We are history itself in motion. And the echo of those words went across capitals, across oceans, across continents. Leaders who thought they had the world in their grip suddenly felt the grip slipping. They realized that what they feared had come to pass. The rise of a voice they could not silence, the rise of a power they could not deny, the rise of a people who had waited long enough. But do not think this was arrogance. It was not arrogance, it was awakening. It was the awakening of pride, of identity, of strength, of a civilization that has given wisdom to the world for thousands of years. It was the awakening of a people who have known struggle, who have endured trials, who have faced invaders and conquerors, and yet never lost their soul. That late night call was not just a political maneuver. It was the sound of an ancient civilization standing up in the modern world and declaring, "We are here. We will lead. We will shape the future, not be shaped by it." Do you know why the world order shifted in that instant? Because power respects power. The world had been comfortable ignoring, dismissing, sidelining, but suddenly they realized they could not afford to. Suddenly they realized the tables had turned. The caller was no longer asking for a place at the table. He was building a new table, and the world had no choice but to sit. The call was not an invitation, it was a declaration. It said, "The future will not be decided without us. The decisions you make will not stand unless we stand with them. The balance of power has moved, and you must move with it, or be crushed beneath it." The beauty of that moment is that it was not violence that brought the change. It was not chaos, not destruction. It was vision, clarity, unshakable determination. Too many times in history, the world order has changed because of war, because of death, because of empires rising by blood and falling by ruin. But this time it was different. This time it was the power of words, the strength of will, the courage to speak when silence would have been easier. That is what made the world sit up in shock. They were ready for armies. They were ready for weapons. They were not ready for conviction. Conviction broke their plans. Conviction shattered their assumptions. Conviction changed the rules. Now listen, because this is important. When the world order changes, most people don't realize it right away. They think the old rules still apply. They cling to the old hierarchies, the old privileges, the old illusions. But deep down they know it is gone. That is what that late night call did. It planted the seed of a new reality. And everyone who heard it, directly or indirectly, knew that nothing would ever be the same. Some resisted, some mocked, some pretended nothing had happened. But history doesn't wait for acceptance. History moves forward with the force of those who dare, and in that night, history moved. The consequences were immediate. Capitals across the world woke up to panic. Strategies that had been written for decades suddenly looked outdated. Alliances that had been secure suddenly looked fragile. The old guardians of the so-called order began to scramble, trying to figure out how to respond. But the truth was they were already too late. The call had already been made, the new reality had already been born, and their hesitation was proof that they were no longer in control. The shift was permanent. The world was now multipolar, balanced not by domination, but by assertion, not by submission, but by recognition. And let me tell you something. When a nation finds its voice, when it rises to claim its destiny, it is unstoppable. That call was not just one man speaking, it was a billion voices carried through him. It was the voice of farmers and workers, scientists and soldiers, dreamers and builders. It was the voice of a land that has given philosophy and mathematics, yoga and science, courage and culture to the world. It was the voice of a billion dreams saying, "We will no longer be silent, we will no longer be second, we will no longer be underestimated." That was why the call mattered. It was not the voice of one man, it was the voice of a nation. From that moment forward, every conversation at the global stage had a new equation. Every negotiation, every treaty, every summit had a new center of gravity. You could not plan the future without factoring in this power. The world order had shifted, and the call was the trigger. It was the lever that moved the earth. It was the sound of destiny asserting itself, of history taking a new turn, of the balance of power finding a new equilibrium. The world had to adjust, whether they liked it or not, and the most powerful nations, who had built their influence on centuries of dominance, suddenly realized they were facing a force they could not contain. That is why the call changed everything, and here is the lesson for all of us: never underestimate the power of decisive leadership, never underestimate the strength of conviction, never underestimate the moment when a leader says, "Enough." Because that moment is stronger than armies, stronger than weapons, stronger than threats. It is the moment when history itself bends. That late night call is proof that the world can change in an instant when courage meets clarity, when destiny meets decision, when one man stands for a billion and says, "The future is ours to shape." One decisive call can turn a nation into the axis of the world order. Think about it. The world has always been shaped not by long debates, not by endless compromises, not by timid whispers, but by decisive acts. And sometimes those acts come not in the form of armies marching across borders or missiles firing across skies, but in the form of one phone call made at the right moment, at the right hour, by the right leader. That call does not just connect one voice to another, it connects the destiny of nations to the flow of history. It takes the balance of power, held in place for decades by the old order, and with one movement it shifts the weight. It forces every capital, every strategist, every general, every economist to stop and recalculate because the center has moved. That is the force of a decisive call, and that is why a single voice in the night can turn a nation into the axis around which the entire world rotates. When the world order is stable, or at least when it appears to be, nations grow comfortable. The powerful ones assume their dominance will last forever. The smaller ones accept their fate of obedience. But comfort is the illusion that blinds the mighty. In reality, order is fragile. It is held together by perception, by the belief that the powerful will always remain powerful. The moment that belief is challenged, the moment someone dares to show that the foundation is not as solid as it seems, everything begins to shift, and it does not take an army of millions to spark this shift. It takes one leader, one moment of courage, one call that declares to the world, "We will not accept the roles you wrote for us, we will write our own." That is the moment when a nation ceases to orbit others and instead becomes the axis itself. Picture the scene: the clock moves past midnight, the world outside is dark, but inside the room the weight of centuries hangs heavy. The air is tense, but the decision is clear. The leader knows that this call is not just communication, it is confrontation. It is not just words, it is destiny. The hand reaches for the phone not with hesitation, but with absolute certainty. And when the words are spoken, they are not just directed at the person on the other side of the line. They are directed at every boardroom, every parliament, every war room, every newsroom across the planet. The call is overheard not just by one, but by all. And the meaning is clear: the world has a new axis. The future will not be dictated without this nation. The plans of the powerful will not stand without its consent. The balance of influence has been redefined in an instant. Why does this matter so much? Because the world is not truly governed by treaties or armies or even money. It is governed by perception, the perception of who leads and who follows, the perception of who makes history and who receives it. The moment a decisive call is made, the perception shifts. The old leaders who thought they could command obedience realize that obedience is gone. The old rules that assumed certain voices could be ignored suddenly collapse. And the nation that made the call is no longer seen as part of the background. It is seen as the pivot, the point around which others must revolve. That is the axis of world order, and that is how it changes, suddenly, dramatically, irreversibly. Every empire in history believed it would last forever. Rome believed it, Britain believed it, the Cold War superpowers believed it, and yet every empire met its challenge, not always through war, but often through the rise of a voice they could not control. Rome collapsed when those it considered barbarians decided to define their own destiny. The colonial empires crumbled when nations once ruled decided to speak with unity and strength. The Cold War ended when walls came down, not with explosions but with conviction. Again and again, history teaches the same lesson. The axis shifts when the silent refuse to remain silent. The decisive call is the modern version of that act of defiance, and it carries the same power. It signals to the world that the gravity has changed and every nation must realign. Do not underestimate the courage required to make that call, because the world order is defended fiercely by those who benefit from it. They will threaten, they will pressure, they will mock, they will try to isolate. But when the call is made with clarity, with firmness, with conviction, those defenses crumble. Fear is powerful, but nothing is more powerful than the voice that refuses to bend. That is why one decisive call can transform a nation from a participant into a pillar, from an observer into the axis itself, because it is not only about what is said, it is about the unshakable belief behind it. Belief is contagious. When one nation dares to assert itself, others watch, they see the courage, they see the clarity, and they too begin to question the old order. That is how revolutions in power begin, not with blood, but with belief. Not with armies, but with a call that cannot be ignored. The reaction to such a call is always the same: shock first. They laugh, they scoff, they dismiss, they say it is just words, but inside they know it is more. Because words spoken with conviction can unravel decades of illusion. Then comes resistance. They try to reassert dominance, to remind the world of their might. They issue threats, they try to intimidate. But intimidation fails when a nation has already risen, and finally comes recognition. The old powers realize that no amount of denial can erase the truth. The axis has shifted. The new voice is not going away. The new balance is here to stay, and once recognition sets in, the world must adjust. Diplomacy changes, alliances are reshaped, strategies are rewritten, all because of one decisive call. Think of the symbolism. A phone call, usually such a simple act, transformed into the lever of history. It is proof that in the modern world, power is not always about who has the biggest weapons or the most money. Power is about who has the courage to define the narrative. The late night call did exactly that. It told the world, the narrative you have written is over, and a new one begins tonight. It did not wait for permission. It did not ask for approval. It asserted itself as reality, and in doing so it forced the world to acknowledge a new center of gravity. That is the essence of being the axis. You do not ask others to revolve around you. They simply must, because reality leaves them no choice. And here is what makes it unstoppable. Once a nation becomes the axis, everything changes. Trade routes shift, security strategies shift, cultural influence expands, nations that once ignored it now seek its partnership, rivals that once dismissed it now fear its rise, friends that once underestimated it now depend on it. Every choice, every move, every negotiation must account for the new axis, and that power is not temporary. It is not a flash of lightning. It is the dawn of a new era, because once perception changes, it cannot return to what it was before. The call made at midnight echoes into every sunrise after it. The world will never look the same again. So understand this truth. History is not written in comfortable meetings or polite discussions. History is written in decisive moments, one call, one voice, one nation daring to declare its place. That is enough to turn the wheels of destiny, to make the world rotate differently, to force every power, every empire, every strategist to adjust their maps. The axis is not chosen by those who sit comfortably at the top. It is claimed by those who rise when the moment demands it. That is why one decisive call can turn a nation into the axis of the world order. Because history does not wait, it moves with the courageous, it moves with the decisive, it moves with those who act when others hesitate, and in that act, in that one call, the balance of the entire world is transformed.